Scores of heads of government and other senior ministers and hundreds of CEOs of some of the world's biggest companies and the director of the FBI, just to put a tin hat on it, are all in Davos. Let's hope Putin doesn't land one of his hypersonic, super intercontinental ballistic missiles on top of them. What a disaster, tragedy that would be. Are they there for good or for evil? You decide on the Twitter and the YouTube and Telegram poll that we are running now, and it's not going very well for Klaus Schwab and the World Economic Forum, self-appointed World Economic Forum, but for some odd reason, if you're anybody at all in what they call the West, you've got to be in Davos. Of course, it costs $50,000 to attend, even to sit in the stalls. And you'd have to have the price of a few magnums of Cristal if you were hoping to gather anyone round you to get the benefit of your wisdom on contemporary events. But in all seriousness, should we really have such shadow world government going on, absolutely lacking in transparency, opaque, with no members of the public able to see or hear what they are deciding, at least until later, when the governments of the Western world invariably begin to implement the policies that were decided upon or at least discussed in detail at Davos. So who's the real ruler of the world? Who is Klaus Schwab anyway? Well, I know his father was a Nazi military officer, and I know he has a strange taste in garb, dressing up like Count Dracula, as well he might. But I know little else of him. Maybe Max Blumenthal can enlighten us on what they're going to be up to in Davos. It was, too, a pretty little Corvette that Joe Biden had in his garage. Unfortunately for him, somebody has decided to release to the public that which they knew weeks before the midterm elections in November of 2022, namely that Joe Biden has been inadvertently misplacing, to use his own words, super secret, highly secret, top secret, confidential American government papers that he had no right even to have seen, let alone have possession of, still less to keep in his garage with his Corvette. Now, the hypocrisy will not be lost on many viewers. The campaign in November of the Democrats was partly centered on the fact that Donald Trump was supposed to have committed the supposedly heinous offense of removing his own presidential documents. Joe Biden's documents were not his. They were President Obama's. Many of them he had no right even to have sight of, let alone possession, let alone take them home like a Chinese takeaway. No, but Donald Trump's possession of documents was sufficient for the FBI to practically smash his door down in Mar-a-Lago in Miami, Florida. Not only that, the officers then roamed around his wife's bedroom, fingering her lingerie. I'm not making that up, but no such thing has happened to Joe Biden. I appreciate that his lingerie is a little less tasteful than Melania Trump. I don't want to go too far down that. I'm being told in my ear not to go too far down that line. But there was no FBI raid on Joe Biden. And in fact, the FBI covered up the exposure of this illegal possession and reckless misplacing of top secret American government material to avoid upsetting the voters, frightening the horses in advance of the midterm elections. But quite apart from that, we discovered that the documents were actually being stored in a garage which was in the possession of Mr. Biden's tenant. He was no longer living, of course, at the address in Delaware where these top secret, including military and strategic diplomatic secrets, were being stored in a garage. So his tenant, we must hope, was a reliable, patriotic fellow, one who could be guaranteed not to hand these documents into, I don't know, a computer repair shop or a second-hand store or throw them in a skip. We must be hopeful that the fellow that was renting Mr. Biden's Delaware home was a pukka fellow of the right sort. And then we discovered the identity of Mr. Biden's tenant. We discovered that from his driving license, which gave as his address the very address where the top secret documents were stashed. Who was that tenant? You've guessed it. No less than Hunter Biden himself, a crackhead, user of young prostitutes, a man who took pictures of himself weighing the crack cocaine and complaining that it was a gram or two light for the money he had paid for it. A man of such reputation that he was drummed out of the U.S. military for dishonorable conduct. Too dishonorable to be in the U.S. military, but reliable enough to have custody of the American government's innermost secrets in the garage in which Joe Biden's pretty little silver Corvette was stored. But here's another peculiar thing. It turns out that Hunter Biden pays rent for his father's house. Now, I don't know about you. I'm a father of 6 children. It would never occur to me that I could charge my children rent. But if I did, maybe I would set the rent, I don't know, a figure that might cover the mortgage, though Joe Biden, of course, long ago ceased to have a mortgage on the property. I might set the rent at the utility bill level, say, to cover the electric, the water, the gas. Do you know what Hunter Biden's rent was for his father's house? $50,000 a month. That's $600,000 a year. That's a bit pricey, isn't it? For any rent. Never mind the rent you're paying to your father. Leaving open the question of whether this was some scam of some kind. Was Hunter Biden laying off this rent on somebody else? On a company, for example? Was it being charged to expenses, for example? And instead of giving it to his father, he was putting it in his pocket for prostitutes and crack cocaine? Or was this one of the ways that the big guy got his 10%? Whoever the big guy is, of course. It's not yet entirely clear, but we know from Hunter Biden's laptop that there was a big guy in the picture who had to get 10% in this picture. Maybe one of the ways that the big guy was collecting his 10% from the corrupt business practices of the Biden crime family was through this apparently grotesquely inflated figure of rental income. Curiouser and curiouser. But the papers keep on turning up Just 5 minutes before I sat down here this evening, Biden's officials have admitted to a fifth tranche of top secret documents that Joe Biden had no right to possess, let alone to have in his property. So I got to wondering, because I'm suspicious now. Calamity has hardened me and turned my mind to steel, you see. And my steely mind is now turning to the possibility that all this material is being dumped on Joe Biden now that the midterms are past, and just in time to get rid of Joe Biden. Just in time for the men in gray suits in the CIA and the FBI to turn up and say, sorry, Joe, your time is up. You are no longer worth it. Your debits outweigh your credits in the great balance sheet of American presidential politics. You know how it is, Joe? You're wandering around on stage lost. You try to walk off the end of a pier in England. You're soiling yourself in front of His Holiness the Pope in the Vatican. Your trips to the lavatory in the West Wing are now so dangerous we're afraid that as you rush to the toilet, you trip over the nuclear football and somehow send the world up in radioactive smoke. So now that these unhelpful documents have started turning up everywhere, it's time for you to shuffle off the stage. And shuffle would be the appropriate word. I'm wondering if we're going to see, and perhaps much sooner than any of us expected, President Kamala Harris. Now, of course, she will not suffer the same problems because she doesn't read anything. I doubt if she can read anything. In parenthesis, let me wonder aloud and anew that Joe Biden, who never wrote a word of his own material in his life, he even plagiarized Neil Kinnock, and it doesn't get much lower than that, actually had a think tank. Joe Biden's think tank. Oxymoron, anyone? But Kamala Harris is, if anything, even more stupid than Joe Biden. And she may very well be the next president of the so-called Western world. She'll talk and laugh a lot on television. Laugh inappropriately often. Laugh inexplicably often. And she's a more comely face, if that's not a sexist observation, than the gerontocratic Joe Biden. But she's intellectually challenged and doesn't even have the excuse of being 90 years old, as Joe Biden increasingly appears to be. Now, only a couple of minutes left to turn to the other big issue. I did a television program for a Middle East station I worked for, Al Mayadeen Television, yesterday. And we were discussing the impact of the economic war launched against Russia by North American and Western European countries in general. We discovered in the course of the show that not only is the ruble the best performing currency of 2022, it has started 2023 with a bang. And the US dollar has fallen below 70 for the first time in many years in relation to the ruble. We discovered that Russia's external debt has fallen in the last 12 months, not risen. And that can be compared to the United States level of indebtedness, which the last time I looked was 300 trillion US dollars. A very great deal of it owed to China, which is the biggest creditor of the United States and its economy, its Ponzi scheme economy. Not only that, Slovenia increased its imports from Russia of 341%. Makes you wonder what Slovenia has done with all those Russian imports. Last time I looked, Slovenia was a very small place with a very small population. I don't know, maybe they're selling them on somewhere. Germany has increased its imports from Russia by 49%. The Russian economy is booming as the German, French, Dutch, European, British economies are collapsing in this bleak midwinter. But then we turned from the economic war, which undoubtedly represents a gigantic stone which we have struggled to lift only to drop on our own feet. We turned to the actual war on the ground. Do you remember? It's not that long ago when they were telling you Ukraine was winning the war. You remember that? You remember when every television station and newspaper in this land, and I assume in your land, was telling you that Ukraine was winning the war? They can't even any longer, to the most credulous, even to the reader of the National Enquirer, peddle that line anymore. Yesterday was the heaviest bombardment of Russian missiles on Ukrainian cities of the whole war. Russia's 600,000 reinforcements are now lined up in a big line which can advance either at any particular point or points or all of it together. Now that they have taken Solidar, and now, according to the Washington Post, Ukraine is about to evacuate from Bakhmut, with its shills telling us it's of no military significance, when 8 months ago they told us the fight was so vital because of its immense strategic defense importance. Now that the encirclement and kettling of army after army of the Ukrainian armed forces in the eastern part of Ukraine is now throttling the very life out of poor Ukrainian soldiers who are now surrendering in large numbers, and those who don't, alas, are dying in large numbers, whilst their president cavorts online with his Hollywood pals at the Golden Globes. The war has turned disastrously against NATO. A private military company, Wagner, not even the Russian armed forces, a group of Russian mercenaries, liberated Solidar from the NATO armies. And we keep getting treated to news flashes. Germany is giving Leopard tanks. And then it turns out the tanks will not be arriving until 2024, when the war will be over. Challenger tanks, but only 12 of them in a country of 600,000 square miles across a front which stretches from the Black Sea to the Baltic. This war is being lost now at a catastrophic rate for NATO, which has depleted virtually its entire inventory of munitions and weapons that it requires for its own defense. I've joked here before, if Russia wanted to keep the tanks rolling, they could reach Berlin and nobody would be able to stop them, because all the equipment has been given to Ukraine and destroyed, except where it ends up on the black market. Well, enough from me, because after me comes U.S. political royalty, the one and only Max Blumenthal. Stay tuned. He'll be right up.